1845. 129 men, the finest sailors, the best officers, the invincible pride of the British Royal Navy. They set sail on the two most advanced ships the world had ever seen. Iron-reinforced vessels carrying pianos, libraries of 1,000 books, and enough canned food to survive for 3 years. Their mission? To conquer the Empire's final dream, to find the mythical Northwest Passage. They sailed into the Arctic wilderness and vanished from the face of the earth. 129 souls dissolved into the ice. For decades, the world heard only silence until the stories began to leak out. Stories not of glory, but of madness, of sickness, and of one final horrific secret buried in the frost. Welcome to the Kanata Files. Today, we open one of the coldest cases, the Franklin Expedition. In the mid-19th century, the British Empire was at the undisputed zenith of its power. The sun, famously, never set on its territory. They had mapped, charted, and claimed nearly the entire globe, except for one final, defiant blank spot on the map, a frozen labyrinth of islands and ice north of Canada. The Northwest Passage. For centuries, this was the mariner's holy grail, a potential shortcut from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a route that could rewrite global trade. But by 1845, the obsession was no longer just about trade. It was about closure. It was the last unsolved problem on a planet that Britain believed it had already mastered. To conquer the passage was to plant a flag on nature itself, to prove that nothing, not even the Arctic, was beyond the reach of imperial technology and will. The Admiralty, the most powerful naval force in history, decided it was time to end the game. They spared no expense. This would not be a voyage of mere discovery. It would be a statement of overwhelming force. They chose two of their best warships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. These were not ordinary wooden ships. They were battle-hardened machines. Terror had proven herself against the young United States in the War of 1812. Erebus was fresh from a triumphant 4-year exploration of Antarctica. Now, they were refitted as ice fortresses. Their hulls were reinforced with thick iron plates. Their bows were solid wood, designed to smash through the ice pack. And for the first time, they were fitted with the era's most advanced propulsion. 25 horsepower steam engines, torn from locomotives and adapted for the sea. They were powerful, but inefficient. They guzzled coal and screamed with the noise of the railroad. Inside, they were luxury hotels floating in the wilderness, a central hot water heating system, a library of over 1,200 books, silver-plated cutlery for the officers' mess, even a piano. They were, in effect, a piece of Victorian England, hermetically sealed and sent to conquer the void. The expedition was designed to be entirely self-sufficient for 3 years, and it would be fed by a technological miracle: canned food. Over 8,000 tins of preserved meats, vegetables, and soups were commissioned, enough for 129 men for 1,095 days. This was revolutionary. It promised fresh meals years into the voyage, protecting the crew from the sailors' ancient scourge, scurvy. The contract was awarded to a supplier named Stephen Goldner. He was given only a few months to produce the massive order. The tins were sealed, painted, and loaded into the holds. No one knew it, but many of them were already ticking time bombs.
An invincible mission needs an invincible leader. The Admiralty chose Sir John Franklin, a famous name, a national hero, a veteran of the Battle of Trafalgar. At 59 years old, this was his last chance at ultimate historic glory. He was, by all accounts, a kind, decent, and deeply religious man. But as an Arctic commander, he was a man with a dark past. Decades earlier, Franklin had commanded the 1819 Coppermine expedition, a disastrous overland trek through the Canadian North. It was a catastrophe of poor planning and starvation. Of the 22 men who set out, only 9 returned. The survivors only survived by eating lichen, their own leather boots, and, according to reports, the bodies of their fallen comrades. One man was even suspected of murder, of hunting other members of the party for food. Franklin returned to England not as a failure, but as the man who ate his own boots. The press and the public celebrated his endurance. They conveniently overlooked the cannibalism and the deaths. It was a grim, terrible omen, one that everyone, in the excitement of empire, chose to ignore. The truth is, Franklin was not the first choice. The Admiralty's best Arctic men, Sir James Clark Ross and Sir Edward Parry, both turned the command down. They were perhaps too experienced. They knew the true unforgiving nature of the ice. They felt they were too old or that the mission was too risky. Franklin, who had been serving a quiet, difficult term as governor of Tasmania, was desperate to restore his reputation. He lobbied hard for the job. For the Admiralty, he was the perfect solution, a celebrated public figure who actually wanted to go. The command was his, a final victory lap.
May 19th, 1845. Erebus and Terror leave port in Greenhithe, England. The mood is a festival. Crowds cheer from the banks of the Thames. Paintings are commissioned, ballads are written. This is not an exploration, it is a coronation. Not one of those 129 men, not even Franklin, could imagine they would never see England again. Their last letters home from Greenland were full of optimism. They complained about the mosquitoes, but spirits were high. They were ready. Late July 1845, Baffin Bay between Greenland and Canada. The captains of 2 whaling ships, the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise, spot Franklin's ships. They described a majestic sight, Erebus and Terror, moored to a giant iceberg, seemingly waiting for the perfect moment to enter the ice maze. The whalers were invited aboard for dinner with the officers. They shared drinks and laughter. They were the last Europeans to do so. The next morning, the whalers watched as the 2 ships weighed anchor and sailed west into the Lancaster Sound. And then, silence. The first year passed, 1846. No news. The Admiralty was not worried. This was normal. Franklin was equipped for 3 years. Silence meant the plan was working. The second year passed, 1847. The silence began to feel heavy. The third year, 1848. The ships were now officially overdue. The Empire's proud optimism turned into a widespread, creeping fear.
In London,
one woman refused to accept the silence. Lady Jane Franklin. She was not the stereotype of a grieving Victorian widow. She was tough, intelligent, famously well-traveled, and utterly relentless. She was, in every way, a force of nature. Lady Jane launched a one-woman campaign. She pressured the Admiralty, shaming them for their inaction. She wrote to newspapers. She petitioned Parliament. She even wrote to the President of the United States, Zachary Taylor, pleading for American help. She offered massive rewards from her own fortune. She masterfully used the press to turn her missing husband from a naval employee into a national martyr. She made the search for Franklin a public obsession. The world had to find him. And so, in 1848, the largest, most expensive, and most desperate search operation in human history began. For the next 11 years, dozens of vessels and thousands of men from Britain and America scoured the Arctic. They faced the same icy hell that swallowed Franklin. Many of their ships were trapped. Many nearly died. Some did die. The search for the dead created more dead. For years, they found almost nothing. Until 1850, a search party exploring Beechey Island, a desolate spit of gravel, found it. The first trace. Not a message, not a ship, but 3 graves. 3 carefully made graves with wooden headstones neatly aligned. Petty Officer John Torrington, Private William Brain, and Private John Hartnell. All died in the spring of 1846, their very first winter. The records found nearby said tuberculosis. This was a chilling discovery. 3 men were dead, but where were the other 126? Nearby, they found a staging area, a hut, a workshop, and a stack of over 600 empty canned food tins. They had buried their comrades with dignity, and then, where did they go? Beechey Island was a dead end. It only deepened the mystery.
The official naval search parties found nothing. They were looking for British sailors in British ships. The answer would come from a different kind of man, Dr. John Ray. Ray was not a Navy man. He was a rugged Scottish physician working for the Hudson's Bay Company. He did not command, he listened. He lived with and learned from the local Inuit. He respected their knowledge, adopted their survival techniques, and spoke their language. While the Navy was sending massive, failing expeditions, Ray was mapping thousands of miles of coastline on foot and by dog sled, eating what the land provided. In 1854, near Pelly Bay, Ray met a group of Inuit hunters. They told him a story. They said that 4 years earlier, in 1850, they had met a group of about 40 Kablunas, white men. They were far south of Beechey Island. They were thin, sick, and starving. They were dragging a heavy boat over the ice, heading south. Through sign language, they communicated that their ships had been crushed by ice. The Inuit sold them a small seal. It was all they had. Later, the next spring, the Inuit returned to the area. They found the men's campsite, and inside, the bodies.
The Inuit told John Ray something that horrified them. From the mutilated state of the bodies and the contents of the kettles, it was clear that these men, in their final, desperate moments, had resorted to eating their own dead. Ray was skeptical until the Inuit hunters brought him proof. They sold him items they had found at the death camp: a silver spoon, a fork, a small star-shaped medal. Ray took them back, and they were identified unequivocally. The silver belonged to the officers of the Erebus and Terror. The Inuit story was true. When John Ray brought this sober, factual report back to London, Victorian England exploded. Not in horror at the tragedy, but in outrage at John Ray. The establishment could not accept it. Heroes of the Royal Navy, Christian gentlemen, cannibals? Impossible. It was an offense against God and against the empire itself. The greatest writer in England, Charles Dickens, led the charge. He was a personal friend of Lady Jane Franklin. He wrote a long, furious article, The Lost Arctic Voyagers. He refused to believe the story. He wrote, quote, "We do not believe in the Inuit story." Instead, he painted the Inuit as savage liars, treacherous, and covetous. He suggested that the Inuit had murdered the weakened crew. It was a vicious, racist character assassination designed to protect a national myth. Lady Jane Franklin, in her grief, sided with Dickens. She used her immense influence to destroy Ray's reputation. He was denied the £10,000 reward he was owed. He was ostracized by the very admiralty he had served. The world chose to believe a noble lie over a terrible truth. Ray's report was buried, and for over a century, the story of cannibalism was just a forbidden whisper.
But Lady Jane still did not know where the ships were or what had happened to her husband. She funded one last search, led by Captain Leopold McClintock. In 1859, on the coast of King William Island, exactly where the Inuit had told John Ray the tragedy occurred, McClintock's men found a man-made pile of stones, a cairn. Inside, a thin metal cylinder. And inside the cylinder, a single piece of paper. It is the most important and most tragic discovery of the entire saga. It is known as the Victory Point Record. It is like a message sent from the grave. The paper was a standard Navy form. The first part was written in a cheerful, neat hand. It read, May 28, 1847, HM ships Erebus and Terror, wintered at Beechy Island. All well. All well. This was incredible news. Nearly 2 years after they vanished, as of May 1847, they were safe, though trapped in the ice. But then, the searchers noticed something else. Scrawled around the margins of the same piece of paper was a second message, in a different handwriting, hurried, desperate. It was dated almost 1 year later. April 25, 1848, HM ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd April, having been beset since 12th September 1846. It stated that 105 souls had landed here. And then the fatal line. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th June 1847. And one final, chilling sentence. And start on tomorrow, 26th,
for Back's Fish River. In one instant, the veil was lifted and immediately slammed shut. Franklin was dead. Look at the dates. The All Well message was written in May 1847. Sir John Franklin died just 2 weeks later, on June 11th. He died before the true collapse. He died before the desperation, before the desertion of the ships, before the death march. His wife, Lady Jane, would spend the rest of her life creating a myth of a hero who died searching. The truth was, he died quietly, of unknown causes, locked in the ice, just as the long Arctic winter was ending. The 105 survivors were now on their own. They were on a desperate death march south, dragging heavy lifeboats across the ice towards a river hundreds of miles away. They never made it.
Time passed, 130 years. The mystery remained. What went so wrong so fast? What killed them? What turned Royal Navy sailors into skeletons on the ice? In 1981, a young scientist named Owen Beatty decided to look for answers not in maps, but in the bones. He and his team went to Beechey Island and did something controversial. They exhumed the first 3 graves, the graves of Torrington, Brain, and Hartnell. They were digging into the permafrost, a frozen, concrete-hard soil. When they opened the coffin of Petty Officer John Torrington, they gasped. Preserved by the permafrost, his body was nearly perfect. It looked like he was sleeping. His blue eyes were still open, staring into eternity. It was a haunting human connection, reaching across 135 years. This was not a historical figure. This was a man. Beatty's team took tissue samples, and they found it. The answer was lead. The lead levels in Torrington's tissue were 10 times higher than normal. He was suffering from severe, chronic lead poisoning. They tested the other bodies, the same. Where did it come from? The canned food. Beatty examined the 600 tins left on Beechey Island. The supplier, Stephen Goldner, in his rush to fill the 8,000-tin order, had done a shockingly bad job. The tins were sealed with thick, sloppy gobs of lead solder on the inside. With every meal, the lead was leaching into the food. For 3 years, from their very first meal, they had been slowly, agonizingly poisoning themselves. Lead poisoning doesn't just kill. It is a slow, insidious destroyer. It causes weakness, vomiting, anemia, and crucially, it attacks the brain. It causes confusion, paranoia, irritability, delirium. It drives you mad. The expedition didn't just fail, it degenerated. It's likely that in those final months, the 129 men were not a coherent naval unit. They were a terrified, sick, and paranoid group of men, possibly led by officers who were no longer sane. And then, Beatty analyzed the bones found scattered on King William Island. He found exactly what the Inuit had described. On hundreds of bone fragments, he found cut marks, saw marks, marks made by knives. Scientific, undeniable, forensic proof of cannibalism. Charles Dickens was wrong. Lady Jane was wrong. The Inuit whispers were true.
The truth was out, but one last great question remained. Where were the ships? The notes said they were abandoned, but the Inuit told other stories of one ship that sank and another that drifted for years on the ice, a ghost ship. For a century and a half, searchers, scientists, and adventurers ignored the Inuit stories. They trusted Victorian maps. They trusted computer models. They found nothing. And then, in 2014, a team from Parks Canada tried a new strategy. They used modern sonar technology, and they listened. They went to the Inuit historian Louis Kamukak. He told them a story passed down through generations of a large ship that sank in a specific area of water. The search team went to that exact spot, and they found it. HMS Erebus, sitting on the seabed in 11 meters of water, strangely intact. 2 years later, 2016, a Canadian ranger, an Inuit named Sammy Kogvik, was on a research vessel. He told a story his grandfather had told him of seeing a large ship's mast sticking out of the ice in a bay further north. The crew, on a hunch, diverted the ship to that bay, Terror Bay. They found the other one, HMS Terror, dozens of miles away, in a location no one expected. It was preserved almost perfectly. Plates were still stacked in the mess. Wine bottles stood on shelves. It was like it had sunk yesterday. The Inuit oral history had been 100% accurate. These ghost ships tell a story. The Terror looks closed up, orderly. The windows are shut. The anchors are stowed. It suggests an orderly, planned desertion. The Erebus looks more chaotic. The Victory Point record said 105 men marched south, but the discovery of the Erebus suggests a new, darker theory. It seems that after beginning that death march, a small group of men, perhaps 15 or 20, tried to return to the ship. They were sick. They were starving. They realized the march was hopeless. They made it back to the Erebus, their only hope. They died on board as the ship slowly sank beneath the ice.
So, what really happened? The Franklin File shows us a perfect storm of tragedy, a cascade of failures. 1. They were trapped by the ice, a failure of nature, and perhaps a bad roll of the climate dice. 2. They were slowly, agonizingly poisoned by their own food, a failure of technology. 3. They had an ailing leader, Franklin, who died too soon, leaving them commanderless at the critical moment, a failure of fate. 4. They made the fatal wrong decision to abandon their safe provisioned ships for an impossible march south, driven mad by the lead in their veins, a failure of desperation. And 5. When everything collapsed, they did the unthinkable, a failure of survival. History isn't always beautiful. It isn't heroic marble statues. Sometimes history is raw, cold, and brutal. It's buried under ice, under noble lies, and under 170 years of time. We have found the ships. We have analyzed the bones, but we will never know the last words the final fears, or the final choices of those 129 men. The Franklin file was never truly closed.